Welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, and this is The Politics of Survival. I'm TaraReade, and we have a great guest with us tonight. It's been a really tough few weeks for everyone, and in particular for civilians in the Gaza Strip, Palestinians that are experiencing something that I've never seen in my lifetime, a genocide, unprecedented, the war crimes that Israel is committing. There are very few reliable press outlets really covering the nuances of this situation, and also with detail and honesty and integrity, what's really going on and what's behind it. It is not a complicated situation. That's one of the propaganda tools that Israel tries to make. It's a very simple one. They are the occupiers, and now they are basically, I don't even want to use the word ethnic cleansing because it's not strong enough. They're committing a Holocaust to a population, and it's heartbreaking. Without further ado, I want to bring the editor and founder of MintPress News, Mnar Adley, and Mnar is someone I admire, a work I follow, and I've followed for a very long time. Mnar, thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me and for talking about the genocide in Gaza.
When I start talking about it, I get cheered up because there's journalists that I knew of, that I was communicating with, that are gone, that are killed by the Israel forces. Starting way back with Shireen. Shireen was supposed to be on my show, and she was killed a couple weeks before her appearance. And I knew her mentor. So this is, it didn't start October 7th. It started way back. And it started back to 1948, actually. So could you start out by just telling our family that watches, our audience that participates in this, who you are and how you came to found the news outlet that you did, and go from there.
Sure. So I am the founder and director of MintPress News. We are an independent watchdog journalism outlet that covers the permanent war state and the profiteers of the permanent war state. And while we are just about 12 years old at MintPress, I would say MintPress was born when I was 13 years old, after I had lived under Israeli occupation and apartheid for 3.5, almost 4 years as a preteen and into my teenage years. And so having witnessed the brutality of the apartheid regime, seeing bombs being dropped on civilian homes, having our water cut off, having lived under military curfews, and just being a child that went to school every day during the second Intifada when it had broken out, only to see many of my classmates not come to school because they were being blocked at checkpoints. It was really devastating and a lot to process. And so when we had moved back to the United States, where I'm actually born, I'm born and raised in America, but I just lived in Palestine for those short 3.5, 4 years, because that's where my family is originally from. They're Palestinian, from Jerusalem, from the old city. And when we had moved back, it was my first time being exposed to war propaganda. It was a few months before September 11th. And as a 13-year-old kid, I had turned to the media to keep up to date with what was going on back home in Palestine, only to find the media flipping the narrative, presenting it as a religious war, people fighting each other for thousands of years, Muslim versus Jew, never through the lens of occupation, never through the lens of apartheid, never through the lens of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and the fact that the United States uses Israel as a military proxy for itself in the Middle East. And then after September 11th, a couple of months later, September 11th came. I was once again turning to the media to make sense of the world around me. And I witnessed how the media beats the drums of war, how it manufactures consent for war by framing news stories in a certain way that dehumanizes the victims of our war. And so that's really where MintPress was born. And at 13 years old, having seen the way the media painted Palestinians and the way that media justified its 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I knew at that age as a teenager, while other kids were, having, partying and having their first teenage experiences, my heart and mind were in the media. And I saw that there was a void in independent voices and journalists and people like myself who had lived under war, to provide an alternative to the media propaganda machine that was continuously beating the drums of war. And this is, of course, living in a post 9/11 era, where we were ruled by George Bush and his handlers in the White House, who launched those disastrous wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I took the pain and that PTSD that I had suffered from living under occupation and the Islamophobia that we were seeing after September 11th, and knew that it was journalism that I wanted to pursue. And so that's where really MintPress was born. Now, sorry, long answer, but that's where it all started.
Oh, I mean, that's a really substantive answer. And you're also award-winning journalist as well. You've won 2 major awards that I know of. And in fact, a smaller award came from INN, from Indie News Network, last year.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, for your outlet. But and they're so wonderful. They volunteer actually unpaid and help me get my podcast out, because I'm shadow banned and suppressed, as you know.
Absolutely.
So what you're telling me is really moving, in the sense that you're talking about coming of age in journalism, but as well as coming of age in an apartheid state, and in a very formative age, I might add. So how did that inform you now? And when you look back at it and I don't know if you have children or not, or maybe you're an auntie, but like, how does that inform how you're looking at other kids coming up now? And when you're seeing history repeat itself, but even worse, with what's happening right now it
actually feels like we're living in a post right after 9/11 all over again, with the way that the media is manufacturing consent for Israel's bombardment of a civilian population. At 13 years old, I was first exposed to propaganda, and I was also first exposed to what life was like living under bombs, living under a military occupation. It's an unfortunate reality that no child should have to live through, but that became the lens in which I began to see the world from. And when I looked around me at the kids and the mass public in the United States, I saw them as asleep, because they were consuming a corporate mainstream media that was only owned by 6 corporations, and they control what over 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read. And I think that number is even smaller now for how many corporations own our media. And now we're actually even consuming news at the behest of big tech giants that also work directly with NATO-funded think tanks like the Atlantic Council, and weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin and Boeing and General Dynamics. And they also work directly with the state of Israel. And the reason why I say it feels like we're living in the same kind of era, because shortly after September 11th, one of the most famous videos that CNN and MSNBC played was a video of Palestinians celebrating Eid, a religious holiday after Ramadan. And they were handing out candy and they were celebrating Eid, but CNN planted that video after September 11th and said that Palestinians were celebrating 9/11. They were celebrating the terrorist attacks against America. And so that's the kind of propaganda we are seeing today. The entire basis of the October 7th Hamas attack on Israel that we've come to know, the entire basis and narrative of what happened that day much of it has been proven to be false. And it's not even being talked about within the mainstream corporate media. CNN has retracted the 40 beheaded babies, so has the Biden White House, but it's too late because they had already pushed that story out. When CNN and MSNBC planted that story of Palestinians celebrating Eid in Gaza, they also retracted that story about a month later after pressure and people exposed that story was not Palestinians celebrating 9/11. That was in fact Palestinians celebrating Eid. And so the media is continuously pushing these fake stories And in fact, what we know about October 7th that is coming out from within the Israeli military itself is that the majority of those killed were actually soldiers, and that civilians were actually, Israeli civilians were being targeted and killed by their own.
Yes.
And so even though we know these things have come out, this new information, which completely has reshaped the narrative about what has happened on October 7th, the media is still pushing, many outlets, including Politico. Every week I see a story on their website leading with the 40 beheaded stories as if it's real.
Yeah, the 40
It
beheaded.
never happened.
But now you have babies that actually died, preemies that have actually died, 39.
Exactly. So today we have images of actual Palestinian premature babies, about 40 of them that were connected to incubators. They were let in the incubators to breathe. They're premature babies, and they have had to be unplugged because the Al Shifa hospital has run out of fuel. They're running off of generators now for electricity. And of course, the media is not really showing this image, this really just heart-wrenching image of these babies, because Palestinian lives don't matter. And I think that's one of the biggest things is that we've learned from this media propaganda campaign by Western corporate media, which, by the way, I don't even call them establishment media anymore. They're an extremist media beating the drums of war. And the way they do this is through soft propaganda of dehumanization of the victims of our war. And so you'll see outlets framing every single news story with one simple line of Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. Israel believes Hamas has built tunnels here. Israel says that Hamas is using these hospitals as a human shield, or the people inside the hospital as human shields. Hamas is using these ambulances to ship weapons. When we have, it's like, you know, the Palestinian people cannot be given the same kind of humanity as Israeli civilians. We're constantly being dehumanized, and the word Hamas has been used as like this really bad word within, you know, Western corporate media, and it's because of what we don't really know of what's happening on the ground.
Well, you know, they've labeled it as a terrorist organization. And I had a conversation 2 weeks ago with someone, and I said, look, you know, my family came from Ireland and emigrated to the US, much of them, and people can call the IRA terrorists. They're not terrorists. The occupying force, the British Army, labeled the IRA terrorists. They're actually a resistance force in my mind. But I'm, you know, that's my background. And in the case of Hamas, if you look at the real origins of Hamas, it's a resistance organization, and it has other, you know, so there's an argument there. And the argument is the way the propaganda works, is how to, by labeling something terrorist, you're dehumanizing, you're making the ultimate evil enemy, you're making that without question, those people should be killed without a trial, without due process. It's like a word that you use to demonize a group or a person in that case. So
and that's what I mean. And that's what I mean. It feels like we're living in a post 9/11 world, because terrorism was used to justify the terrorism that our country launched on Iraq and Afghanistan that resulted in 2 million people dead in Iraq, 2 million dead in Afghanistan. And hospitals at that time were being bombed and targeted. Civilians were being bombed and targeted. Chemical weapons by the United States were ironically being used on civilians in those countries. And so right now, because this word terrorism is being pushed around, civilians in Gaza are being targeted, and their deaths are just being forgotten and whitewashed.
It's stunning, really. Besides the fact, of course, the electricity, the starvation, the lack of water, bombing the water truck when there are people desperately in need, leaving people under the rubble, when if they use their bulldozers instead of knocking down houses to try to save some people and some children, but instead 1,500 people remain under the rubble, most likely by now dead. And it's stunning. You know, with Iraq, we saw it, but I think with social media now, and now, you know, I wanted you to speak to this about social media, how has this changed the ability for them to whitewash and get this propaganda out and make and dehumanize when we're seeing images of babies and families being wiped out and it's happening in real time. In Iraq.
Well, what we
So talk a little bit about like what that means, seeing it roll out, a genocide basically roll out on Twitter and other social media platforms.
Well, now people around the world and media organizations cannot ignore the plight of Palestinians. We are seeing Israel's bombardment of Gaza. We're seeing Israel's targeting of civilians literally live on TV, live on social media. And Israel has spent millions of dollars on targeted ad campaigns, targeting children and targeting adults to equate Hamas with ISIS. And again, that's their attempt to dehumanize Palestinians and label them all as Hamas and terrorists. And now we know that billionaire oligarchs have launched a campaign worth over $50 million to propagandize Americans to decrease their sympathy with Palestinians and push a very pro-Israel narrative.
Oligarchs are doing that. Can you name a couple? Let's call them out.
Absolutely. It's being led by billionaire oligarch Barry Sternlich. He is courting 50 other billionaires to fund the campaign, including Google CEO Eric Schmidt, Dell CEO Michael Dell, and financier Michael Milken. And of course, just those 4 people, their net worth is around $500 billion. And so these are Wall Street and Hollywood investors and billionaires that have come together to counter the narrative about what's happening in Israel and Palestine. And it's because on social media, Palestinians have won the hearts and minds of people around the world. More and more people around the world are opposing Israel's bombardment of Gaza. They're calling Israel what it is. It's an apartheid state. They're calling it ethnic cleansing. They're calling this genocide. They're calling this a Holocaust. And that's what it is we're watching a Holocaust in real time being perpetrated against a civilian population. And that's where we're seeing the propaganda war being played out, is between civilian journalists like Mu'taza Azaiza, who are just simply live streaming what they're seeing as they walk through the streets of Gaza where civilians are being targeted, versus a multi-million-dollar propaganda campaign led by these billionaires, led by the state of Israel, led by the Israel lobby. And yet they are spending all of this money, and it's quite obvious that the world has spoken in support of Palestinians. And this is really not about taking sides, like I'm pro-Palestinian or I'm pro-Israel. It's like, are you against genocide or not? That's very, very simple. That's all it really, really is.
Yeah, it's about being pro-human. And there are many, you've seen the amount of Jewish people in America that are speaking out, not in our name, those
Exactly.
and then and so I think there's kind of people convolute the Zionists versus the Jewish people, but Zionism is different, and not every Jewish person is a Zionist, and not every Zionist is even on board with Bibi. So he was not very popular actually right before this happened. There's a theory, and because you're the editor of this news outlet, I know you have to be careful because it's unsubstantiated. But there is a theory, because of those Tomahawk helicopters that were filmed on October 7th, that there was American, in other words, made, that there were CIA boots on the ground, and that maybe that music festival, part of that was a false flag. And by false flag, what I mean is that they were actually doing some of the sniping and killing of their own people. Israel did, but also that the CIA was somehow involved, and that somehow this is all tied into the economic interests of the Gaza Strip, which has a lot of gas and oil reserves, and they wanted the land free, and they want to own those. The US and Israel want to own it. And right now you have the Arab nations uniting, even before this happened, they were uniting with economic ties to the East. Do you think that that's a theory, a possibility?
It's not a conspiracy theory. No, it's not a conspiracy theory. No, I mean, what we know about the previous wars that Israel launched against Gaza, now the CIA part, I'm not entirely sure, but the economic interests that Israel has in building the Ben Gurion Canal, so that it has access to the Red Sea and trade options there, and also all of the gas, and it's mostly gas reserves on the coast of Gaza. That is not a conspiracy theory. I mean, these are openly made statements by Israeli officials. In fact, I believe it was after Operation Protective Edge, Nafiz Ahmed was fired from The Guardian after he wrote he was a contributor to The Guardian. He got fired because he actually, through leaked emails and memos, military memos from the Israeli military, he published them where they openly stated that they were launching this war against Gaza at that time so that they can ensure that they have full access to the gas reserves off of the coast of Gaza. Now, I'm not entirely sure how much gas is off of the coast of Gaza, but it's one of the largest gas deposits in the region that has been untouched. And it was only recently discovered in the last decade. And so
it's worth there's estimates it might be up to $1 trillion in total between the gas and some of the oil reserves that are in.
Well, and what does this remind us once again is that this is not a religious war. This is not about supporting the only Jewish, country in the world or the only democracy in the Middle East. Once again, we are reminded, and this is what we do best at MintPress, is that all wars are based on lies, and they serve the purpose of occupation, exploitation, and profits. And this certainly serves all of those purposes. The weapons manufacturers right now, from Lockheed Martin to Raytheon to Boeing, are benefiting. Their stocks are up at a record like 10% in just a matter of weeks of this crisis starting. We know that Israel wants to control the resources in that region, and it's not a conspiracy because Israel has been controlling the water access in that region as well. I mean, this is the desert region, and they have taken control of all water access. They've been in disputes with countries like, Egypt and Sudan to ensure that they have access to the oil reserves, the water reserves in that region. We know that Israel has been involved in the war in Syria so that it could benefit from the now US and Israeli occupied oil fields in the Northeast. So, wars for oil, wars for gas, wars for resources is not a new concept. It's certainly not a conspiracy theory. I mean, this is the fact of the matter.
There you have it. And yeah, that's what a lot of reporting is leading to into those factual things that are happening. And I had said about a month ago that I thought that the US is most likely trying to provoke a hot war with Iran. And obviously the movement of troops and the movement, some of the sources that I had kind of gotten that information from, they seem to be on target as far as that goes. I wanted to come back. I wanted to step back a minute to journalists, because one thing I noticed that's not being covered, and Western journalists themselves are not talking about, is the sheer amount of murdered, targeted, and we're not talking about journalists caught in crossfire or collateral damage, which is a term they like to use, which I think is just disgusting when you're talking about human life. But what's really surprising to me is you had 51 active Palestinian journalists at the time, right around October 7th. There were more, there was closer to 100. But now they've killed 34, as far as I know, but not just killed them, they targeted their families and bombed their homes. Like, they were purposely targeted, even though, and sometimes they'd be wearing their full press gear, just like Shireen was murdered, a year ago. So could you talk a little bit about that, about your ability to get on the ground news with Palestinian journalists and what's going on there, and how we can get Western journalists to talk about it? Like, you'd think that they would be interested in knowing that other journalists, other colleagues are being targeted.
Well, first, let's establish the fact that most of the corporate media journalists that exist at CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, a lot of these journalists work directly with the state of Israel or with our national security state. And so that doesn't mean all of them, but many of the prominent journalists do. And so for them to care about the lives of Palestinian journalists is out of the question, in my opinion, because we are considered the other, the unworthy victims. But yeah, we are down to just a few handful of journalists left in Gaza. And, Mu'taz Azaiza is one of the main journalists that we get our news from. He's live streaming everything that we can see. And he's actually a journalist that I know personally and that I've worked with. He actually filmed a documentary for MintPress 2 years ago about the previous war in Gaza. And he's only 24 years old. And so who's leading this coverage in Gaza now are these young, early 20-year-old somethings. And they didn't ask to be put in this position. Many of them were photographers. Many of them were just, creating social media videos. But they were forced into this position because of the war and what Israel was doing. And we saw Israel target the family of Wa'il Dahdouh. He's the main Al Jazeera correspondent in Gaza, whom we've also spoken to and interviewed in the previous war in Gaza. Israel has targeted the media towers in Gaza in previous wars, including the last war, which the AP was working out of, Al Jazeera was working out of, other corporate journalists were working out of. And it was really interesting at that time when Israel bombed them, the AP would not say that Israel targeted the media tower. That's where these corporate media outlets' agendas are. They don't see Israel as the perpetrator, because they are working directly with the state of Israel on how to cover the war in Gaza and Israel's occupation.
We are in an information war as well as a war on the ground, no doubt. So when you have in an information war, intelligence plays a huge key, right? So you have Mossad and CIA working hand in hand, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And they are, that's why a lot of Palestinians are currently really skeptical about some of the aid that is going to be entering Gaza, including the United Arab Emirates proposed field hospital, because in the past they know that many times these hospitals that are being aided to them by the state of Israel or Israel's allies, that they act as intelligence gathering hubs for the state of Israel.
Well, we only have a few minutes left in our time together, but I wanted to spend the last few minutes with you, giving you the last word on a couple of things. First, I want you to kind of give an idea of where you think this is all going right now and kind of the reporting that you're getting. And then secondly, if you could talk about your outlet and your other journalists that are in that outlet and how people can follow their work and help and support.
Sure. I don't know. I can't predict the ending of all of this, but what we do know is that Israel does plan a several months campaign to drive all of the people out of Gaza if they haven't killed them all already. And Israel is also trying to pull the United States into a hot war with Iran and with Lebanon, and Israeli military generals have made it very vocally clear. They vocalize this openly. And people can find these interviews within Israeli media, and you can just Google them, go on TikTok, but they've openly stated that their agenda is to take all of Gaza, to push all of Palestinians out of Gaza into the Sinai Desert if they don't kill them all. And the US taxpayer is footing the bill for this, because the United States is actually requesting billions of dollars in aid for Ukraine and Israel under the guise of humanitarian aid. But what the United States is actually doing is they're leading the way in building tent cities for people in Gaza. Again, it sounds nice, like, oh, we'll help the refugees, we'll help them. But what we're doing is we're aiding Israel's ethnic cleansing plan out of Gaza. Next on the list, of course, is the West Bank, to drive people out of the West Bank and push them all into Jordan. And the same campaign will be used that Israel launched in Gaza, will be launched in the West Bank. Of course, this is if Israel gets its way, that's their plan. And they have their eyes on southern Lebanon. Israel is currently bombing southern Lebanon. They've been bombing southern Lebanon for the last month while simultaneously bombing Gaza. And they've already killed, I believe it was over 70 Hezbollah resistance fighters in that process. They've also targeted a few civilians that have been killed in southern Lebanon. And so what this means for the region, you know, despite all of the normalization campaigns by Saudi Arabia, by the Gulf countries and countries like Morocco and Egypt, the mass population in these countries are not supportive of those normalization campaigns. We're seeing people in mass in countries like Egypt say that they are ready to put their lives on the line for Palestine. We're seeing the same thing, people saying that in mass in the countries of Jordan, saying they're ready to put their lives on the line for Palestine. And those countries are cracking down on people, they're arresting them. But in fact, the more people see the genocide in Gaza, the bloodshed, the children being targeted, the more fire this is fueling people's energy to want to help the people of Palestine. And so if this war continues, we are going to see a lot of civil disobedience and uprisings taking place in countries like Egypt and Jordan. And that could be the fall of those countries. And this is real. This is happening. In fact, countries in the Gulf have actually already warned that if this war continues, we're going to see a shift in the entire population in the Middle East and what these countries could look like very soon. Obviously, nobody wants it to go that far. Everyone wants a ceasefire to be announced right now. But as long as the United States and Great Britain continue to help Israel and send them weapons, and the European Union continues to say, you know, we stand by Israel and there are no red lines, and Israel is just given basically the thumbs up to just do whatever it wants to do, Israel will continue this war. And war is good for business. And so the people here in the United States, the handlers, Joe Biden's handlers in the White House, the weapons manufacturers, they're not complaining about that. But they have woken a sleeping giant because people in mass are out on the streets by the hundreds of thousands. We saw almost a million people come out on the streets in London just this weekend in support of Palestine. And so although war is good for business, this has woken a sleeping giant, and people are using their support for Palestine to make their voices heard. They're disrupting the system. They're doing sit-ins. The boycott campaign is expanding, and this is hurting Israel's economy. It's hurting, you know, Starbucks revenues, McDonald's revenues, and we have the power to stop this war. We actually do have the power if we unite. And, you know, protesting is one thing, but we need to actually disrupt the system at this point with the boycotts, with the sit-ins. We need to be at every single, you know, senator, congressman's office. We need to be doing sit-ins and putting pressure. And for the last part about MintPress, you know, we're continuing to follow this crisis as we have been for a very long time, covering all of the Western wars, from the wars in Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen. We've continued to cover these wars, and we're going to continue to cover this war and to expose the agendas of the permanent war state. But I think we're living in a very critical time in world history where people are rising above the propaganda. They're seeing through it. And I really, really hope that, you know, when and if this war is over, I hope they can take that energy and their ability to have seen through this propaganda to know that there is no such thing as a humanitarian war. There is no such thing as dropping bombs on civilians as a means to save people. All wars are based on lies, and we will continue to expose that war agenda.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the time and your energy and all the focus that you put into this. Now, where can people find MintPress News on Twitter and in general?
So MintPress News, people can go to our website, mintpressnews.com, where we have a lot of investigative journalism. And we share all of that, of course, on all of the social media channels when people search for MintPress News. And but we do focus a lot on social media friendly content for the lower attention span crowd. So.
All right. Well, thank you again. It's been wonderful, and it's been an honor to have you on the show and to have you with me and educating all of us about what's happening, and also talking openly about your background and your childhood and what you experienced.
No,
So,
thank you. Thank you so much, Tara. It's an honor to be here with you.
So everyone watching, please make sure you like and subscribe and follow MintPress News, follow independent media. We need the support. We need your help because we're all getting shadow banned and silenced right now by big tech. And we have to push through that so we can push through the propaganda. All right, everyone, take care and good night. Okay. Thank you.